All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Geopolitics in Conflict show. We're going to be talking to Scott Ritter. So he's on his way connecting here. So I just spoke with him on the phone. So he will be here in about a few minutes. So I'm going to just like start chatting with you guys. And I look forward to this conversation. Really. Scott is someone I trust. I trust his judgment. So, and he is a military analyst, so he knows what is he talking about. So this is the reason why we decided to really have Scott, because his inputs and insights will provide you a clear understanding. This is sort of put the Western media to shame. That is the reason why with Scott is kind of he is the deal. Hi, Scott. Here you are. How are
Hello,
you?
how are you? I'm doing fine, thank you. Yourself?
So excited to have you. I know we've been trying to connect for months and months. I know you were out of the country. I was out of the country. I was in Poland as well. I went to Eastern Europe, Germany, and so forth. And some of our viewers were like, when can you bring Scott? And I said, listen, he's a busy man. And when time permits, he will be here. So be patient, and here you are. So just to give our viewers one thing I would like to share with them about you and I, what is in connection with us here. You graduated from Franklin Marshall College, right?
I did, a long time ago.
Well, guess what, Scott? I used to do track and field for Franklin Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
You ran track and field for
I did track and field for 5,000 meters for them. And I was
football.
You did football. I was about to get scholarship from them, and just things didn't work out with the track and field coach, Peter Carroll, at that time. So I was kind of like moved on to Millersville University in
Well, I know Millersville very well.
But that's where I graduated from. So I became aware of your name when you graduated from there, and I was like, well, wait a minute, because it was during the UN inspection and all that, which you played a major role into that and brought the truth to the fore. And I was like, well, wait a minute, that's Scott Ritter, right? He's the guy who graduated from FNM. And some people in Lancaster said, yeah, he was here. He is an alumni. So
I'm an alumni. I used to go, I still go back for homecoming week. I feel bad about Millersville. We enjoyed Millersville because it had an active fraternity life, so we would go down and crash the fraternity parties. But I actually studied, and I have to say that the Millersville Library had a very good Russian history section, and I probably shouldn't say this because they're probably going to come after me, but I still have one of their books. So maybe someday I'll go back and return it. I don't have to pay a hefty fine, but
well,
it's property of Millersville State University on it. So
yeah, well, it's interesting. That's why I was like, I'm gonna share this with our viewers and share it with you. I never wanted to tell you this ahead of time. I was gonna like keep it as a good surprise per se. So the other thing I want our viewers to know, that we also share another thing. You were as a military analyst in the Marines. I was in the Army. I was with 312th MI unit. And I'm sure you know that 312th, we used to work in coordination with the Marines at some point. So that's one of those things we all share. So, well, we're so excited to have you, Scott. As a matter of fact, I do have a lot of topics to cover, which we can cover in one session here. So most likely I will be calling on you again for dealing with the historical aspect to put this in perspective. And here is the reason why, Scott, is because I feel a lot of people around the world not only are misinformed and misled, is they are not putting the current geopolitical issues within their proper historical context. And I'm going to start with the first sort of a conversation, but in the form of question. What do you make up out of the NATO summit that just concluded? And I read your article, by the way, about Nothing Burger, which I will share with our viewers. What do you make out of all that?
Look, NATO, I mean, you talk about historical perspective, we need to put it in a historical context. Understand that when NATO was founded, it was founded on in the era of the Cold War. It was founded as an ostensible defensive alliance. designed to protect Western Europe from any potential Soviet aggression. That was the purpose. As Lord Hastings, the first Secretary General of NATO, pointed out, the purpose of NATO was to keep the Americans in, keep the Germans down, keep the Russians out. Keep the Americans in meant that they needed to have a formal treaty-related structure that prevented America from doing what it is naturally inclined to do: retreat back into its shell and become isolationist. People have to study the lead up to World War II and how difficult it was for Franklin Roosevelt to get the United States to commit. In fact, if it weren't for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, it would have been very difficult for the United States, given its isolationist tendencies, to get actively involved in the fighting in Second World War. So once we did get involved, we became a world leader, and not just militarily, but economically through Bretton Woods system, et cetera, through the United Nations politically. Europe wanted to make sure that we stayed in, and we wanted to make sure we stayed in. From a military perspective, remember Dwight D. Eisenhower warned about this military-industrial complex.
Mm-hmm.
And so the establishment was like, we need a treaty structure to keep America committed politically. And so that was what NATO was done. It was also designed to keep Germany down. A lot of people today forget what Nazi Germany was. It was one of the most horrific manifestations of a perversion of ideology that one can imagine, a murderous regime that inflicted horrific crimes across the board, and killing, including being responsible for the deaths of 27 million Soviets. We defeated Nazi Germany, we being the United States, the Soviet Union, France, and Great Britain. And Germany was occupied, split up into 4 occupation zones. And a lot of people felt that Germany should never again be allowed to have the opportunity to combine its industrial capacity with German nationalism that could lead to German militarism, that we need to keep Germany down. And so the idea of NATO initially, because when NATO was formed, Germany was not part of it. Germany was broken up, West Germany, East Germany, and there was no peace treaty. So one couldn't speak of a sovereign West Germany at that time. Later on, we did bring West Germany in, and we began the process of militarizing it, reindustrializing it, and now in the post, after the Berlin Wall came down, we see, we have Germany talking about spending hundreds of billions of euros to rebuild its military to do, of all things, confront Russia. It's as if history doesn't matter. So keeping Germany down was an important part of NATO, and keeping the Russians out. This was all premised on the notion that the Soviet Union under Stalin had aggressive tendencies towards Western Europe, and left unchecked would move and occupy more countries. But this, of course, history shows this was false. The Soviet Union had been devastated by the Second World War. They were in the business of rebuilding that which had been destroyed, not seeking new conflict. But that was the purpose of NATO. And for a number of years, for several decades, NATO fulfilled its mission. Kept the United States in, kept Germany down, kept Russia out. But then the world changed, the Cold War. And as I said, Germany reunified, so it was no longer about keeping Germany down. The United States no longer had a reason to be in Europe. The Russian threat was gone, and Russia was no longer a threat, so it was time for Europe to make good with Russia for peaceful coexistence, which meant NATO should go away. There's no reason for NATO to exist, but NATO stayed on. And when NATO stayed on, George Soros wrote an article in 1993, talked about this, about the future of NATO. And he said, for NATO to continue to exist in its current configuration, it's going to need to expand, bring in new members, and it's going to need to have an enemy, somebody to focus on. That enemy is going to have to be Russia. So right off the start, even when Russia was weak, seeking to have friendly relations, NATO was configured to confront Russia, to provoke it through expansion, to create the sense of a Russian threat that justified the continuation of NATO, that would keep the U.S. in. Germany's no longer being kept down, though. Germany is now this large, expansive power, and the Russians can't be kept out because they don't want in. So NATO is confused. It's a confused organization. And this is important to realize in the lead up to the Vilnius summit, because a lot of people keep talking about Article 5, of the importance of Article 5, that is collective defense. You attack one, all come in. Article 5 was important during the Cold War because given the scope and scale of the armies that were positioned in the European theater, once the Soviets started attacking, There wasn't time for a debate, a dialogue, a discussion for parliaments to decide whether to mobilize. NATO had to be on a constant war footing, ready to respond. And this meant that NATO had to agree that an attack against one is an attack against all. Therefore, there will be a large standing NATO military force. The United States was an important part of it, with close to 300,000 personnel permanently stationed in West Germany. I lived in West Germany in the 1970s. My dad was part of that contingent. I know that which I speak. But now we have a situation where, NATO has to build it. So Soros wrote about this. He talked about the need to expand NATO, but he said something interesting. In a future conflict with Russia, he said, we can't have a situation where NATO body bags come home. He said, because NATO won't accept body bags in this number. We being the collective West, have to find a source of East European manpower that we then append NATO technology to and use them as a proxy to engage the Russians militarily to bring pain to Russia. And the body bags that come home will be Eastern European, not NATO. And now we fast forward 30 years and we see that that's exactly what's happened. Ukraine is nothing more than a source of Eastern European manpower. To everybody out there who bought into the discussion of Ukrainian membership, understand this. NATO was never going to let Ukraine into its ranks, ever. Ukraine doesn't qualify, first of all. It is one of the most corrupt regimes in the world. It has endemic problems that are systemic and are unsolvable, to be frank. There are 7 criterion that have been laid out there, only 2 of which Ukraine has ostensibly met. And even then, there's a lot of waivers involved in meeting that. The other 5, Ukraine will never meet. And that's just a statement of fact. Yeah. And then the other thing is Ukraine's a nation at war. I mean, remember, this is a war that we provoked, that we created. And under Article 5, if you allow Ukraine in while it's an active conflict, NATO assumes responsibility for that conflict and must engage in direct confrontation with that. And that would mean a war with Russia. That's nuclear. The world ends. Ukraine was never going to be in. And the thing about this summit is that once and for all, it's been made clear. It should be clear to everybody, including Ukraine. You will never be part of NATO, ever in your life. Not only that, the George Soros scenario has now become clear. It's clear to the Ukrainians that this war will go on to the last Ukrainian, that the United States will never intervene on their behalf. NATO will never intervene on their behalf. Our job, our mission is to provide NATO technology to a source of Eastern European manpower to bring pain to Russia. That's been the strategy all along. And this summit proves that. The other thing is we have NATO struggling to define who it is. Remember, in the aftermath, while they were building up for the Russian conflict, there were people saying, we don't want to spend this money. They forgot how to fight. Back in the 1970s and 80s, NATO was a forward-leaning operation. We had core level engagement, army level engagement on the European soil. That means that we had enough people there to initiate, sustain, and prevail in a combat situation. We could take casualties and remain viable. We had artillery, we had fuel, we had other ammunition, we had logistical sustainability, all there in Europe. None of that exists today. None. We can't do this. We have heavy brigades that go over there that have enough artillery ammunition to last less than a week. Understand this. I'll give you a couple examples. During the Gulf War against Iraq, the United States military fired 60,000 artillery shells during the entire conflict. Mm-hmm. Russia fires 60,000 artillery shells in one day. Ukraine, on average, fires 7,000 artillery shells. My dogs are objecting to somebody fires 7,000 artillery shells in a day. It means in 10 days, Ukraine expends more ammunition than we expended in the entire Gulf War. We produce 75,000 rounds of ammunition a year. Under the new defense procurement budgets that are out there, we're going to ramp it up to 85,000. But again, 1 year's production won't supply Ukraine for 1 month of war. And General Cavoli, who's the commander of U.S. forces in Europe, the Supreme Allied Commander, 4-star general, U.S. Army, spoke at a Swedish Defense Forum in January, where he said that NATO couldn't imagine the scope and scale of the violence taking place in Ukraine today.
Okay.
Now think about what that says. If you can't imagine it, you're not ready to fight it, because you've been in the military. What do? When we build a contingency, it's a contingency to a problem we have imagined. We have imagined an enemy of a certain size, certain capabilities. We have devised a plan, a concept of operations to prevail against that enemy in armed conflict. So we have built a structure, the number of troops we need, amount of ammunition we need. We've planned for the duration of conflict. We've set aside the resources necessary for that duration, plus a little bit, because you always hedge on the side. And those are our plans. And what Cavoli is looking at is saying that if we took our existing contingency plan and applied it in Ukraine, we would be defeated. It's a preordained outcome. We would lose this war because we haven't imagined it. We're not prepared for it. We don't have the ammunition sustainability. We don't have the force structure. We don't have the resilience. The Ukrainians are losing 800, 900, 1,000, 1,200 men a day. How big is a heavy armored brigade? 5,000 guys?
How about, yeah.
So in a week, we lose everybody. They're done, gone. And we have nothing to replace them. There's not like we're stacking armored brigades behind them for sustainability. That system's done. So NATO is a paper tiger. And that's the reality. We spent 20 years learning how to fight. Don't get too offended here, but Afghan wedding parties and Iraqi villagers, because that's pretty much what we were doing. And we forgot how to do large-scale ground combat. We forgot what combined arms operations are. We forgot how to do a division-sized passage of line. You know what I'm talking about. You got a division online fighting. They've stalled, or for whatever reason, their momentum is gone. The next division has to come through, pass through the lines to continue the operation. A very delicate operation, which, if not done properly, causes both parties to bog down and become targets. You have to train for this, practices all the time. I was in a field artillery unit. I trained nonstop in 29 Palms, California for 2.5 years to master the art of combined arms warfare. That's constant live fire training. That's very expensive training. We don't do that anymore. We don't train at the brigade level anymore. We don't train live fire like we used to do. My battalion fired more ammunition in 1 year than the entire Marine Corps fires today in a year.
Wow.
That's just the way it is. Budgets are different. So that's our military. We haven't imagined this conflict, so we can't fight it. And yet now we have, in this summit, what do we see? We see Jan Stoltenberg talking about creating a 300,000 strong rapid response force. Now, people need to understand that there's currently a 40,000 strong rapid response force. There's nothing rapid about it, and there's nothing responsive about it. We can't get 40,000 people together. I challenge you to do that right now. Mobilize. That would have been what if I were attending the summit, I would have turned to Stoltenberg and I said, "Hey, boss, what does rapid mean? What's your advance notice you need? We need 48 hours notice. America's going to withdraw from NATO in less than 48 hours. You have 40,000 people deployed right here, right now. Go. Running clock. Can't do it because they don't exist.
They can't. Yeah, logistically they can't. There is no way. Because this is, Scott, will be almost in the equivalency of QRF, which is even, but 40,000 QRF,
they don't have it
with the small numbers, but 40,000, there is no way they can do it.
So now they want to have 300,000. So it's a joke. The NATO summit is a joke. It's basically an organization that's desperate. Remember, for 20 years, NATO was committed to Afghanistan as part of the nation-building exercise that we had ongoing there. And the United States, up until 2021, was going around telling NATO, you have to commit more. We need more from you, more. Don't worry, we're here. We're America. We're behind you. We're backing you up. But we need you to commit. And so NATO dug deep, got the money, put the troops in there, reconfigured their militaries. And then in August of 2020, we leave. Just like that. And NATO's going, wait a minute. You just told us to raise a couple $1 billion. We're doing that right now. And now you're gone. And we have to leave. So NATO is licking its wounds. And everybody was saying, is NATO worth continuing? Is the United States a reliable partner? These are serious discussions that were taking place in 2021. And so this Ukraine crisis is in many ways an artificial crisis that has been provoked by the United States and NATO to give them a reason to exist, to forget about Afghanistan and now reconfigure to the Russian threat. But here's the thing, they can't do it. There is absolute ignorance about Russia. Remember, this wasn't supposed to be a sustained military conflict, not at all. Go back to 2021. All the discussion was about sanctions. If Russia goes into Ukraine, we were told, they will be hit with massive sanctions that will sink their economy, that will collapse their country. Putin will have a domestic crisis. Putin would probably not survive this domestic crisis. That's what everybody's thinking. So the Russian military going in, and remember, a lot of people, including myself, said if Russia goes in militarily, this thing's going to be over very quick. General Miley, chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, 72 hours. The CIA briefed Congress, 1 week. Nobody anticipated a special military operation. Nobody anticipated the soft touch. But what everybody anticipated is that Russia would come in, the sanctions would hit, and Russia would have to retreat, not because NATO or Ukraine defeated them, but because the Russian economy and domestic pressure would compel Russia to withdraw. That was the hope. It failed. Today, the Russian economy is stronger than it's ever been in its entire existence. It is thriving. They have beat the sanctions. They have crushed the sanctions, which now means that the solution is military, and NATO isn't ready for this. Back in April or March of 2022, there was a chance for a negotiated settlement. I mean, that was the whole reason for the Russian military action. People forget this. They think that it was to take Kiev and all this stuff. It was to put pressure on the Ukrainians to compel them to go to the negotiating table, and it succeeded. Ukraine attended 3 sessions in Gomel, Belarus, attended 2 sessions in Turkey, and were prepared for a final session in Istanbul on 1 April, where they would sign a treaty which they had already approved and signed off on. They were going to sit down, the war would come to an end. And this would have been fairly favorable terms for Ukraine. Yes, they would have lost Crimea, but they had lost that already. Yes, Lugansk and Donetsk would become independent. But Kherson, Zaporizhia, Sumy, Chernihiv, Kiev, all those territories that Russia had taken would be returned. And proof that the Russians were serious about this, they went ahead and voluntarily withdrew from Kiev, from Sumy. But here's the thing. When they withdrew voluntarily, the West spun it as a Russian defeat. They said, see, the Ukrainians have pushed them back. Ukrainians didn't push them back.
It wasn't, yeah.
Russia voluntarily withdrew and said, this is a good faith measure to prove to you that when you sign this treaty, we're gone. We're out of here. We're not staying. But instead, the West looked at it and said, Russia's weak. We can beat Russia. So rather than sign that peace treaty, which would have preserved your nation, saved hundreds of thousands of lives, we want you to continue this war, and we're going to give you tens of billions of dollars of equipment. That was the gambit. It failed. It failed again when they gave them this new equipment that led to the creation of this new army that's dying right now in a failed counteroffensive. There is no military solution, and this summit proved this. The summit proved that Ukraine can't beat Russia, and that NATO and the United States lack the resources that can sustain this fight. This war is lost. This war is finished, and NATO and the United States know this, but they can't admit it. So one of the big problems coming out of this summit is, how do you find a soft landing? How do you avoid the crash? Because everybody, I mean, they didn't let Ukraine in. Ukraine has been put on notice. They will never be able to join NATO. Ukraine's been giving nothing more than more promises of more equipment, but we see what happened to the last equipment. It all got destroyed. Ukraine has to sacrifice more manpower. They used to sacrifice this manpower under the belief that something would come out of this summit, that Ukraine would be given a roadmap. Ukraine would be given a timeline for the guarantee of Ukrainian membership of NATO. Instead, what they got is, you ain't never going to join. And
so will I be wrong, Scott, if I say, with the statement from, for example, French President Emmanuel Macron suggested during the meeting, right after its conclusion, that now we're going to be sending long-range missiles to Ukraine or supporting that. Will I be wrong if I am to say, as an analyst thinking outside the box, well, maybe Russia would just move forward and take over the Donbas and be done with it?
Well, I mean, Russia's goal. I mean, that's the stated objective. Vladimir Putin has actually given a speech to that effect. He said that our goal right now is we are going to assert sovereignty over every inch of Russian territory. And right now, the Russians view Lugansk, Donetsk, the Donbass, Zaporizhia, and Kherson to be Russia. And so there's portions of Kherson, portions of Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk that are currently occupied by Ukrainian forces. And so the goal of the Russians right now are to evict. But Russia's not going to do this in a way that causes them to sacrifice thousands of lives needlessly. Right now, look, you were in the military.
Yeah.
If two peer level forces come together in a meeting engagement, generally the side that wins is the side, if they're roughly equivalent size, is the side that can attain about a 1.2 to 1 kill ratio, meaning that you're killing slightly more than they're killing of you. And then you're able to exploit that through professional training, et cetera, through maneuver to gain an advantageous position, either through fire or maneuver or both, that compels the enemy to withdraw before being totally destroyed. Because, at some point in time, when you get certain advantages, then the problems manifest themselves in increasing fashion, and you get overwhelmed, and it's a collapse. So most professional militaries are able to sense, hey, I've been outflanked here, I'm getting suppressed here, it's time to withdraw. So it's about a 1.2 to 1 advantage. And so if you're seeking the physical destruction of a military that has 500,000 people, that means that you have to be willing to lose, because you're going to be the attacker. You're going to have to lose 500,000 plus people. Russia's not in the business of losing 500,000 people anymore. So what Russia has done is created a situation where they have fallen back on their doctrinal strength, the defense. They have dug in, they've created this impenetrable line, and what they're doing is inviting the Ukrainians to commit suicide on their defenses. Right now, the kill ratios are 8 to 1 to 10 to 1. That's unimaginable. That's crazy. That means for every Russian that dies, 10 or 8 Ukrainians are dying. Now, we got to put this in perspective. Right now, it's estimated that 24,000 Ukrainians have died since this counteroffensive began back on June 8th. 24,000. That means that Russia, if it's a 10 to 1, has lost 2,400 guys. Could America imagine 2,400 body bags coming home? No, we can't. Not at all. Russia, so let's not pretend that this is an easy war for Russia. They're losing a lot of guys. This is a very costly fight for them. But now go over to the Ukrainians. These are World War I level casualty rates. These are numbers that haven't been seen since the Second World War. And even then, many battles never got this many casualties in this short a period of time because of what I said. Units tend to withdraw when they're confronted with an enemy who has achieved maneuver superiority or fire superiority. You withdraw, you preserve your force, fight another day. Here, the Ukrainians are dashing their strength on a prepared defensive line. They're just getting slaughtered, and they're just doubling down on stupid by repeating this process. This is a tragic outcome, but eventually they're going to run out of troops. And when that happens, and we're already seeing this right now because they are running out of troops, they're having to divert resources from the northern area near Limon, divert them down to sustain an offensive in the Zaporizhia area and in the Bakhmut area. And as a result, the Russians, who are feeling every day, feeling the pressure, notice there's less resistance and they're moving forward. So the Russians are actually advancing in a number of locations as the Ukrainians strip troops away to bring them to another front. And you also have to keep in mind that Russia is sitting on reserves, uncommitted reserves of 180 to 220,000. These are already formed into offensive-oriented units. They have the equipment, they have the training, they have the sustainability, and they're just waiting for the time to come. And that time will come when Ukrainian army approaches collapse. You're a military professional, you understand what I'm talking about. There comes a point in time where unit integrity fails. Usually when you've suffered, in some units, up to 20% casualties can lead to failure. Elite units, you can probably get that, 30%, 40% casualties, and even elite units start to collapse. Command and control collapse, cohesion, morale, the whole thing. Remember, units are also designed to work together as a team. So the more casualties you suffer, the less effective your team is. Some of the things that you are assuming that are going to get done aren't getting done. The guy who's supposed to protect you on the flank here ain't protecting you on the flank, which means the enemy's maneuvering around this flank. Now they've hit you here, you divert. Now you've opened this up, and that's when I talk about the sequencing of events that lead to the destruction of a unit. The Ukrainian military is fighting on a very long front, over 1,000 kilometers, and as you start to lose resources, that means that your ability to sufficiently man that front is weakened, erodes. The Russians have reserves that haven't been committed. You don't have any more reserves as the Ukrainians. And so as you get weaker, the Russians will get stronger, and the Russians are going to end up retaking all of the Russian territory. Now, the question is, what do they do after that? And Vladimir Putin has provided a hint. He said that once we secure Russia, we are going to push Ukrainian forces back the distance that equals the maximum range of the weapon systems provided to it by NATO, which right now, I think we're talking about the HIMARS system, about 150 kilometers, which means that from the territory of New Russia, the Ukrainian forces are going to be pushed back at least 150 kilometers. Now, simple map exercise, you've done this before. Yep. You take a map, you get the scale, you take your compass,
reference
you put the 20 in on 0, you put your pencil on the range that you want, and then you draw your range arcs along the border. Go do that on the border of New Russia and Ukraine, and you'll see that the range arc, the 150 kilometer range arc, means that Odessa is now occupied by Russia. Kharkov is occupied by Russia. Dnipropetrovsk is occupied by Russia. These are cities with strong majority ethnic Russian populations, and in the case of Kharkov, in case of all three, strong Russian history. And I have a feeling that once Russia occupies these cities, they're never going to give them back, which means that Ukraine is now shrunk even further. So this is the reality of the NATO summit. There's nothing that came out of the summit that's going to stop Russia from accomplishing what it wants to accomplish. So the key question is, how does NATO prevent this? They can't prevent it militarily, which means at some point in time, they're going to have to go to Zelensky and change the scripts. Right now, he's a script reader who reads the script about standing strong, and he's going to now have to get a new grip about negotiating a just peace. It's a poison chalice we have to drink from, he'll say, but we have no choice to preserve the nation, to stop the sacrifice. I must make this peace. And I think that's what right now they're working on. It's like Hollywood people taking a look at a script and the producer saying, we can't fund that script. We have to change it. And so they have all their screenwriters right now writing the best ending possible. And then they'll hand it to the actor, and the actor will play his part.
Well, the way I feel about because I believe that most in the West, they really do not grasp the concept of that Ukraine is a red line for Russia.